Now let's move into what we introduced before about studying the unconscious role of the hippocampus. Particularly, remember we had patients who had hippocampal damage that we introduced before. To go back to our question about how do you study unconscious memory with this framework, but we're going to build on this and make it more complicated. Okay? Particularly with confidence ratings. Okay? Because we talked about how no physiological studies of implicit memory had been conducted in hippocampal patients. And how do you capture unconscious memories during a conscious memory task? We introduced this idea before. What was the running joke on this? Carefully. Okay, yeah, because that's how porcupines mate. And remember that if we're going to look and try to address these questions on the data that you guys have already been familiarized with, which is that item confidence paradigm, but in patients who have hippocampal damage, if we want to address this, that's a lot more complicated in this framework here, isn't it? Because we don't just have old and new judgments. Those judgments vary on our confidence scale over here. Okay? So now things get a little trickier. Okay? So we're going to dive into this because it's a really good opportunity to understand issues in cognitive psychology and how we can also creatively resolve them. Okay? So we want to do what exactly we talked about here, misses versus correct rejections. This was on the test. You compare things that you previously saw but you did not recognize to those that are new items that are correct rejections. Anywhere where it differs, just like our RT graph over here, can be inferred as representing some type of activity related to something beyond conscious awareness. Okay? Old hat, we talked a lot about that in the class. Okay? Okay, so we already talked about this theoretical framework. Okay? How do we do that with item confidence responding? Okay, so where is the best way to do it? Quick vote. Do you prefer that I draw there, or here? Wait, where? Just not over there. Not over there. Okay. If I do this, are you all on board? Okay. Okay. It's all on this side. We're okay, right? Kind of like our confidence scale. Like that's all one side of the scale. As long as I'm on one side, we're good. Okay. So here's the thing. We have our signal detection framework, right? And we're going to call this targets, lures, 3, 4, 5, 2, 1. These are our new responses. I'll get out of the way in a minute. Don't worry. Okay. Old hat, right? What we want to do is compare misses to correct rejections, right? Which is essentially, we want to compare misses. Misses. Let's try this out a little bit here. We want to compare misses, which are right, to our correct rejections. You guys follow? That was our logic. And it worked. I didn't hear anybody dispute. Always welcome a dissenting view or a challenge to our framework. I didn't hear it. We think it works for the most part, and I agree. Okay? But when you get into these issues of understanding how signal detection process works, particularly within this framework, okay, there's a couple caveats here. Can't really, and this is straight up from the literature. People have literally complained about this. Right? It's going to sound crazy and wonky to you, but they're saying that when you compare our misses in green minus activity for our correct rejections in blue, people say that particularly when you're using this item confidence thing, and they're arguably correct, that it could be possible that if if you have our, let's say your ERP, it could be that any difference between your physiological effects could be due to a tiny bit of conscious memory bleeding in. Why? Because our conscious signal, our targets of what we remember, could have a little bit bleeding in over here of familiarity. If this is supposed to be representing, this signal detection process is supposed to be representing familiarity, it could be. So, yes?
So you're saying there's like a blip of a prime response?
Well, really carefully I would say no to that, because the word prime ruined that statement. Primed means less conscious. What they're saying, do you remember? So we're getting into some real like graduate level cognitive psychology with these details.
I meant for like the miss items. When you missed it, but the
then it's primed.
you still have that.
Absolutely.
So I'm saying there's a blip of prime.
Yes, that's the logic we used in the beginning of class.
Yeah.
That's why it's non-conscious. It's supposed to be primed because they experience it before. Exactly. But that's what we talked about like an hour ago. And so the argument now to contend against that is the same type of minutia, but important minutia, that was over here, which was that maybe a little bit of recollection bleeds in here, and if it is, it should be evident in times when they said source correct. Now we're saying, instead of maybe a little recollection bleeding into the force, now we're saying maybe a little familiarity is bleeding in down here. Okay, and people have said this in the literature. This is like Ken Powler, Mick Rugg. They've gone back and forth on these types of debates, and people have come up with some really creative ways to leverage against this. So one way to overcome that criticism is what we actually did in the data I showed you a couple weeks ago. Okay, because it's obviously complicated. I didn't explain it in that way first. I explained it to you that we looked at these effects, misses to correct rejections in our hippocampal patients, right? I'm going to tell you what we really did, okay? Hang on for your hats. It's going to get a little detailed on confidence ratings, okay? Because remember, what we need to do is we want to achieve the same logic. Consciousness held constant, and compare old items that were forgotten to new items that were identified. You still want to be able to do this, but without being confounded with this. Make sense? Okie doke. Here's what you do. I'm gonna sit here and point it out to you. Maybe not. Here's our distribution. Remember we showed bar graphs before of distributions of old and new responses. You have your old items, right, and our new items. Okay, and here's our response confidence: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They say old items, they say, yes, I remember it to a lot of the times, so they have a lot of responses here. Not a whole lot of misses down here. They have a lot of good correct rejections, not a whole lot of false alarms. Old hat, we talked about that, okay? But what we can see here is, this is like an explicit memory contrast, and we can see like a familiarity-based early mid-frontal effect, okay? Now what you do, though, is you want to hold consciousness constant. Now, we have a very sensitive measure of their conscious experience, and that sensitive measure are the different levels, God bless you, of confidence ratings. Okay, so we need to hold confidence ratings equivalent between our old and new conditions. I'll show you how we do that. So what you need to do is, instead of comparing old and new, such that there's more old items recognized than new, you want them to be the same. Okay, so you randomly select in each confidence column here the same trial, number of trials. So here you find the minimum. Let's start with 3. That's easy. There's only 7 is the minimum between 7 and 19. So you'll only grab 7 random trials out of these 19. You do that for each column here. Only grabs 5 random 4 responses to targets, or to old items, out of the 28. Only 11 of the 54 trials you randomly select. You reject all the other ones. You do the same thing down here. And what you do is now you have a distribution that looks like this of what you're actually going to use. Same number of times you reported that conscious experience of your memory. Whether it be forgetting or recollecting, the number of times that you've said that in this situation is held constant. You average across here now to make your old condition. You average these together to create your new condition. Now your old condition is comprised of exactly the same number of trials as your new condition. There are no differences in what you reported to the experimenter was your conscious experience. Follow? So anywhere where the ERP plots differ cannot be attributed to conscious awareness. The exact same logic that we are applying between misses and correct rejections. Okay? So we're building on the signal detection framework to now integrate some confounds of what, or some more details of how we understand memory to possibly also operate. And so you cannot say that it's due to any low levels of familiarity that might be bleeding in here, because you've actually equated for that. Okay, so it's a really powerful cognitive psychology tool or approach to hold even more of these factors constant. You guys get it? Okay, and so of course, that's when we did that, we saw that there's this whopping deficit. This should be an old figure for you. No pun intended if this was like, this is, so we've seen this before. And of course, it looked like that, and this is how we came to having the leverage experimentally through cognitive psychology to be able to draw a meaningful conclusion about the physiology and the neural and cognitive organization of memory in this particular case. Okay? Aren't you glad I didn't dive into that the first time I showed it to you? Right? It's kind of complicated at first. Is it understandable though now? You guys dig the logic? Okay, makes sense. Okay, so let's skip through this thing. One thing. Oh, okay. Well, here's one last sort of cognitive psychology issue. This is from Larry Squire, past president of the Society for Neuroscience, National Academy of Science member, and he said actually the same year he published a paper about conscious and unconscious memory. He hadn't read my paper, which had just been published at the same time. These things take like 6 months to publish. Right? He says, it sure would be instructive when studying the circumstance of implicit memory if someone could just obtain confidence ratings in association with memory judgments and ask if there's any detectable awareness of which items are correct. All right? Now, when this came out, I had this big shit-eating grin on my face. I was like, yes! He set it up. So he was like the nemesis of the dual process view because he was advocating the single process view that we had been earlier addressing. So there's a longer backstory of scientific controversy going back and forth here. But it really set it up because then what we were able to do with these confidence scales, I'm surprised nobody asked this. What did we do in that contrast? So this is the same figure. This row, or excuse me, this column includes all the confidence scales, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's exactly the same data that we saw before. What could be one potential problem? Nobody saw any trouble with that before. I know it's been a long class and we haven't had a break, so I understand that people might have faded out and not been so contentious in wanting to argue with me about it. How about the fact that we actually are making claims about unconscious memory while actually having included conscious memory responses of hits, all the way in the 5s. Right? When we averaged across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, when we created it, we still included some of these. And you're going to sit here and buy what I'm selling to you and tell you that I can show you something that's non-conscious memory by including trials in which they actually said they recollected? Just like we said there could be a little recollection bleeding in here in the 4s, the argument is that when we compare all these collected here, averaged together, you could have just a little bit of recollection bleeding in. And some of those very, very few trials that were included, that's such a strong signal, it added that big red bump of our ERP. Right? So this is what I wanted to share all these studies with about because they provide really nice illustrative examples of the levels to which people are approaching this at like graduate levels of cognitive psychology as opposed to what we would get in an introductory book or class because we're really dialing into the details of the issues that are at hand at the forefront of the field. Okay? So we're thinking about things in pretty advanced ways. what if there's a tiny little bit bleeding in? So what we did was we did the exact same contrast. This time we eliminated the 5s. We just included 1, 2, 3, 4s. Now remember, I'll show you back here just to remind you what we did. Okay, remember we're averaging across here to create our old versus new. So now we're eliminating these entirely because maybe these 11 trials added a little bit of recollection. And just as foreshadowing, we did it again and we pulled out both the 4s and the 5s. Maybe these 5s added a little bit of familiarity. That still looks conscious memory, right? Okay, so skip ahead, show you what we did, what we found, blah, 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 blah. Okay, took out the 5s. You see the same effect in controls. It's still gone in patients. You take out the 4s, okay, both the recollected and the familiar, and you still see this positive rear effect, posterior effect. Hence, it really is, so this 1, 2, 3s, basically, we're kind of extending it a little bit out to here too, but the idea is that we're basically still comparing, it's particularly in this condition, we're still comparing just these misses to the correct rejections. It's just that we've held it constant, or we've controlled for the possibility that it could be familiarity contributing, because we've included only the same number of trials. Basically, it translates to what people call a strength argument, and we can hold constant and account for memory strength and familiarity. Make sense? Maybe? Kinda? Okay. Okay, so